Welcome to tonight's journey into the Middle Ages, where we'll quietly explore 125 myths, stories we think we know, but that history tells differently. People often imagine the medieval world as dark, dirty and joyless, but the truth was brighter, more complex and more human than legend suggests. Some believed everyone thought the earth was flat, but sailors and scholars knew it was round. Others picture a filthy age without soap or baths, yet rivers, bathhouses and herbs kept people surprisingly clean. Knights weren't flawless heroes of chivalry. Peasants weren't chained forever to the soil. Life was harder than ours, yes, but also filled with laughter, festivals and art. Tonight, we'll move through these myths one by one, from castles and kings to pilgrims and festivals, a tapestry of corrections told slowly and softly, guiding you toward rest. This is 125 medieval myths, a journey into the truths behind the legends. Before we begin, if you truly enjoy these stories, hitting like and subscribe helps me keep making them, and hopefully helps you keep drifting off. Let me know when and where you're listening from tonight. I'm always amazed by the places people tune in. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath in, and then let it out, because once this story begins, chances are you'll be asleep before it ends. Myth. People thought the earth was flat. It's one of the most repeated myths about the Middle Ages, that people believed the earth was flat. Stories often describe medieval sailors as terrified of falling off the edge of the world, but this idea was more a 19th century invention than a medieval one. In truth, educated Europeans had accepted a spherical earth since antiquity. Greek philosophers like Aristotle had written about it. Astronomers like Ptolemy mapped the heavens using a round world. Their works were copied in monasteries and studied at universities. Even sailors knew the horizon, and the stars only made sense if the earth was curved. The round shadow cast on the moon during a lunar eclipse was seen as clear proof. So where did the flat earth idea come from? It spread in the 1800s, when some writers wanted to paint the Middle Ages as ignorant. They exaggerated to make modern science look more enlightened. When Christopher Columbus proposed his westward voyage, his critics didn't argue that the world was flat. They knew it was round, they just believed the oceans were too wide. They feared the ships would run out of supplies. So, the flat earth myth belongs more to modern storytelling than medieval reality. In the Middle Ages, people gazed at the same round sky we do, with a surprisingly accurate sense of the earth's shape. Myth. Medieval people never bathed. There's a stereotype that medieval people were filthy. We imagine peasants caked in dirt and nobles avoiding water entirely, but bathing was actually common. In towns and cities, public bathhouses were popular gathering places. People went there not only to wash, but to socialize. Warm water, steam, and scented herbs made the experience relaxing. Even in rural villages, people washed in rivers, ponds, or wooden tubs. Soap made from animal fat and lye was in use. Records mention lavender, rosemary, and other herbs used to scent water. Nobles had private baths built at their castles. Monasteries required monks to bathe at least several times a year, sometimes more, and physicians often recommended bathing for health. So why do we picture the Middle Ages as filthy? Partly because in later centuries, especially during outbreaks of plague, some feared that water carried disease. They reduced public bathing. By the Victorian era, medieval hygiene was mocked as backward. In reality, medieval people cared deeply about cleanliness. They may not have had daily showers like us, but washing, bathing and grooming were normal. Their world smelled of soap, herbs and wood smoke, not constant dirt. Myth: everyone was a dirty peasant. Another cliché paints the Middle Ages as a world where almost everyone was a ragged peasant. But medieval society was layered and more diverse. Yes, many people were peasants. They worked fields, raised animals and lived in small villages. But their lives weren't all mud and misery. They celebrated festivals, brewed beer and kept their homes tidy. Above them were townsfolk, merchants, craftsmen, bakers, blacksmiths. Guilds organised trades, and marketplaces bustled with goods from near and far. Clothing varied by class, but even peasants wore bright dyed fabrics when they could. Nobles lived in castles or manor houses overseeing land. Clergy served in cathedrals and monasteries. Travelling entertainers, scholars and traders moved between regions. Medieval society wasn't a single shade of grey. It was a tapestry of classes, professions and traditions. The stereotype of everyone as a poor peasant oversimplifies a colourful and varied world. Myth: life expectancy was only 30 years. It's often said that people in the Middle Ages rarely lived beyond 30. This gives the impression that old age barely existed. But that's misleading. The number comes from averages. High infant mortality dragged the overall figure down. Many children died before age 5, which lowered the life expectancy. But if someone survived childhood, they often lived into their 50s or 60s. Records show elders in villages, grandparents in families, and even kings ruling past middle age. There were risks: war, disease, and famine. But long lives weren't rare. Monks, scholars, and nobles often reached respectable ages. So medieval people didn't expect to die at 30. They hoped, like us, for long lives surrounded by family, and many achieved them. Myth: people only drank beer because water was unsafe. Another myth says medieval water was undrinkable, so everyone drank beer instead. The truth is more balanced. People did drink a lot of ale. It was nutritious, with calories from grains, and safer after boiling during brewing. But that didn't mean water was avoided entirely. Villages often had wells or springs that provided clean water. Rivers and streams were used too, though care was taken upstream. Monasteries kept records of water supplies for daily use. Beer was popular because it was filling, mildly alcoholic, and part of culture. But it was often weak, more like a liquid bread than modern strong brews. So medieval people drank both water and ale. The idea that they lived only on beer is an exaggeration. They valued water for cooking, washing, and quenching thirst, just as we do. Myth: everyone was short and sickly. It's often claimed that medieval people were tiny, frail, and constantly ill, but skeletons tell a different story. Average height for men was about 5 feet 7 inches, and for women around 5 feet 3 inches, not far from today's global averages. People could be tall and robust, especially with good diets. Yes, malnutrition happened in times of famine. Plagues and poor harvests took a toll. But in normal years, bread, vegetables, meat and dairy supported health. Medieval skeletons show strong bones and healthy teeth in many cases. Diseases like tuberculosis and leprosy existed, but not everyone was sickly. So the picture of universally small, unhealthy people is misleading. They were not so different from us, sturdy, varied, and capable of long, active lives. Myth. People never travelled beyond their village. Another myth says medieval villagers never left home, living their whole lives within a single field. But travel was more common than we think. Pilgrimages carried people across countries, even continents. Merchants travelled along trade routes, bringing spices, cloth, and stories. Students walked to universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Even peasants left home for markets, fairs, or seasonal work. Wars and crusades uprooted thousands, and news spread surprisingly fast by word of mouth. Some never travelled far, true, but others moved regularly, and villages were not isolated bubbles. Medieval Europe was stitched together by roads, rivers, and human footsteps. Myth. Education was non-existent. We often picture the Middle Ages as illiterate and ignorant, but education was present, even if unevenly spread. Monasteries taught reading and writing to novices. Cathedral schools trained clergy in Latin, law, and theology. By the 12th century, universities were forming, institutions still alive today. Not everyone could read, of course. Peasants learned through oral tradition, songs and stories, but merchants kept records and towns valued clerks who could write. So education wasn't universal, but it wasn't absent. Knowledge flowed through books, chants, debates, and conversation. It was simply shared in different ways than we expect today. Myth. Science slept until the Renaissance. Another myth says science was dead in the Middle Ages, waiting to wake in the Renaissance. But medieval thinkers explored nature with curiosity. Scholars studied astronomy, medicine, and mechanics. They translated works from Arabic, Greek, and Latin. They experimented with optics, leading to eyeglasses. Figures like Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus asked bold questions about the natural world. Hospitals grew in cities and doctors refined surgical techniques. Medieval science was framed by theology, yes, but it was a living tradition, not a void. The Renaissance built on this foundation rather than creating science from scratch. So science did not sleep. It murmured, whispered, and quietly grew in the medieval night. Myth. Medicine was pure superstition. It's easy to imagine medieval doctors waving charms and muttering spells, but medicine blended tradition with observation. Physicians studied humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Though flawed, this system gave a framework for diagnosing and balancing health. Surgeons performed amputations, set broken bones, and stitched wounds. Herbal remedies provided real relief: willow bark for pain, garlic for infections. Hospitals offered care, often run by religious orders. Cleanliness, diet, and rest were emphasized. Leeches and charms existed, but so did practical healing. Medieval medicine wasn't modern, but it wasn't nonsense. It was an evolving attempt to ease suffering built from the knowledge of the time. Myth. People never smiled in the Middle Ages. When we look at medieval portraits, the faces are serious, lips pressed, eyes stern. It gives the impression that people never smiled. But smiling was as human then as it is now. The reason paintings look so solemn is partly artistic tradition. A serious face was seen as dignified, worthy of memory. In daily life, people laughed, joked, and grinned. Songs, poems, and stories are full of humour. Manuscripts include doodles of monkeys, fart jokes, and playful caricatures. Festivals encouraged laughter with jesters, masks, and games. Even in solemn churches, stained glass sometimes showed humorous figures tucked into corners. So medieval people smiled often. The portraits may not show it, but daily life surely did. They lived with the same joys, jokes, and light-hearted moments we do. Myth: houses were always dark and smoky. We often imagine medieval homes as cramped, smoky huts with no light, but homes varied widely, and many were brighter and more comfortable than we think. Peasant cottages had windows covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters. Fireplaces vented smoke through simple chimneys. Larger homes had multiple rooms, glazed windows, and decorated hearths. Urban houses sometimes stretched upward, with shops below and living spaces above. Furniture was sturdy, and walls could be painted or hung with cloth for warmth. Yes, some homes were smoky, especially poorer ones, but innovation improved airflow over time. By the late Middle Ages, chimneys were increasingly common. So while not luxurious by modern standards, medieval homes were not all suffocating huts. They were practical shelters, often cosy and adapted to the climate. Myth: peasants ate only gruel. A common picture of medieval peasants is of endless bowls of grey porridge, but their diets were more varied. Bread was the staple, dark, hearty loaves baked from rye or barley. But peasants also ate cheese, beans, onions, garlic, and seasonal vegetables. Cabbage, turnips, and peas filled gardens. Meat was less common but not absent. Hens, pigs, and goats provided eggs, pork, and milk. Fish, fresh or salted, was regular fare. Special feasts included beer, pies, and roasted meat. Herbs flavoured stews, while honey sweetened treats. So while gruel and porridge existed, they weren't the only foods. Peasant diets were hearty, practical, and far more colourful than the stereotype suggests. Myth: everyone slept in filthy straw. We often imagine medieval people sleeping on piles of dirty hay, but beds came in many forms. Peasants used straw mattresses, but the straw was replaced regularly. It was stuffed into sacks or frames, often with herbs like lavender to keep pests away. Nobles slept in wooden bed frames with feather mattresses, sheets, and blankets. Curtains surrounded beds for privacy and warmth. In monasteries, monks slept on simple pallets, but even these were kept orderly. Hospital records describe bedding being washed and replaced for patients. So while bedding wasn't luxurious for all, it wasn't filthy neglect either. People valued rest, comfort, and the small rituals of a clean sleeping space. Myth: peasants had no leisure. The picture of medieval peasants often shows endless toil with no joy, but leisure was part of life. Yes, work filled the days, sowing, harvesting, tending animals, but Sundays and feast days offered rest. Villages held festivals with music, dancing, and games. People played dice, chess, and ball games. Children had toys, carved animals, dolls, hoops. Seasonal holidays filled the calendar with chances for fun. Leisure wasn't constant, but it was valued. Communities found balance between labour and laughter. The myth of joyless peasants overlooks the songs, stories, and celebrations woven into their lives. Even in hardship, they made time for rest and play. Myth: only men worked. The idea that men did all the work while women stayed at home is a modern projection. In medieval villages, women worked constantly. They planted and harvested crops, milked animals, baked bread, and brewed ale. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and made clothing for their families. In towns, women ran stalls in markets, brewed beer for sale, and even managed workshops. Widows often inherited their husbands' trades, keeping businesses alive. Records show women as midwives, laundresses, brewers, and even moneylenders. Noble women managed estates when men were away at war. So while certain roles were gendered, medieval women were never idle. They carried much of the daily labour that sustained families and communities. Myth: serfs were slaves. Serfs are often confused with slaves, but their situation was different. Serfs were bound to the land, yes, but they had rights. They couldn't be bought or sold individually as slaves were. They farmed land for their lords, but kept part of the harvest for their families. Serfs had protection under law. They could marry, raise families, and pass on their land obligations to children. It was a restricted life, not free, but not total slavery. Many serfs could even buy their freedom or escape to towns, where they became free after a year and a day. So while harsh, serfdom was not the same as slavery. It was a system of duty and obligation, rooted in the rhythms of the land. Myth: women had no rights. The idea that medieval women were completely powerless ignores many nuances. Their rights were limited but not absent. Women could inherit property, especially in regions like England and parts of France. Widows often managed estates and businesses. Noble women arranged alliances, signed documents, and wielded influence through marriage. Queens and abbesses held significant authority. Peasant women had less formal power, but they had roles in local courts and community decisions. Some even defended legal claims in person. Life wasn't equal, but women were not voiceless shadows. They found ways to work within, and sometimes bend, the limits of their time. Myth: guilds excluded all women. Guilds, the powerful trade organizations of towns, are often imagined as male-only clubs, but women did participate. In brewing, textiles, and silk making, women frequently joined guilds or worked alongside them. Some guilds admitted widows to carry on their late husbands' businesses. Records list women as masters in certain trades. In Paris, for example, silk-making guilds had female leaders. It's true that men dominated guild leadership overall, but women weren't completely excluded. They shaped urban economies in visible, practical ways. So guilds were not purely male domains. Women carved out spaces within them, contributing skill and labour to city life. Myth: nobles did nothing but feast. Medieval nobles are often pictured as lazy lords feasting endlessly while peasants worked. But noble life required constant responsibility. Nobles managed estates, oversaw justice, and led military campaigns. They dealt with disputes, collected rents, and organised defence. Hunting, often seen as leisure, was also training for war. Tournaments prepared knights for battle. Noblewomen managed households, servants, and finances. Yes, there were feasts and celebrations, but between them, nobles lived busy, often stressful lives of governance and obligation. The myth of endless feasting erases the work of leadership, demanding, political, and never-ending. Myth. Books were inaccessible to everyone. It's often said that books were so rare in the Middle Ages that almost no one ever saw one. But books were present, especially in churches, monasteries, and universities. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, filling libraries with theology, law, and classical texts. University students studied from shared volumes. Wealthy nobles and merchants sometimes owned prayer books or romances. Books were expensive, yes. A single Bible could take years to copy, but they were not completely absent from daily life. Even peasants encountered books through church services, hearing scripture read aloud. Images in illuminated manuscripts were shown to congregations, carrying lessons through art as well as words. So while not mass-produced until the printing press, books were not invisible. They were treasured, circulated and valued, living presences in medieval communities. Myth. People thought reading was sorcery. Some stories suggest medieval people saw reading as magical, suspicious, or even evil, but reading was respected, not feared. Clergy were trained to read Latin. Merchants read contracts and kept accounts. Kings issued charters that required written words. To those who couldn't read, books might have seemed mysterious, but mystery is not the same as sorcery. People admired literacy, often associating it with wisdom. Even magical-sounding books like alchemy texts were studied seriously, not dismissed as witchcraft. Literacy was linked to authority and knowledge, not danger. So reading was no act of sorcery. It was a respected, practical skill, admired by those who could not master it themselves. Myth. Only monks could read. The idea that literacy was reserved only for monks oversimplifies the truth. Clergy were certainly literate, but they weren't the only ones. Nobles often learned to read, especially women in wealthy households. Merchants needed literacy to keep accounts. Lawyers, clerks, and scribes filled towns with documents. By the later Middle Ages, schools taught children in towns and cities. Some peasants, especially in prosperous regions, could read basic texts or prayers. So while literacy rates were lower than today, it wasn't an exclusive monastic skill. Reading stretched across classes, professions, and genders more than the myth suggests. Myth. Latin was a dead language. We often call Latin a dead language, but in the Middle Ages it was very much alive. Latin was the language of the church, scholarship, and law. It allowed people from different regions to communicate across Europe. Letters, contracts, and official records were written in it. Scholars debated in Latin at universities. Monks prayed in it daily. Kings issued decrees in it. It wasn't anyone's first language, but it was a shared second language connecting people across borders. So in the Middle Ages, Latin was not dead. It was the living heartbeat of intellectual and spiritual life. Myth. Knowledge was stagnant. The myth of a stagnant Middle Ages ignores centuries of progress. Medieval people developed windmills, heavy ploughs, and water wheels that transformed agriculture. Mechanical clocks appeared in the 13th century. Eyeglasses improved vision. Architecture soared with cathedrals of stone and glass. Universities formalized education. Trade networks spread new crops and ideas across continents. Knowledge didn't stagnate. It adapted, grew, and prepared the ground for the Renaissance. The so-called Dark Ages were not truly dark, but full of slow-burning light. Myth. People didn't know about ancient Rome and Greece. It's sometimes claimed that medieval people forgot about the ancient world, that they lived in ignorance of Rome and Greece, but the legacy of antiquity was always present. Monks copied and preserved Latin works of Cicero, Virgil, and Ovid. Roman law influenced medieval courts. Kings styled themselves heirs to the Roman emperors. Greek texts were harder to access in Western Europe, but through contact with the Arab world, Aristotle and Galen returned in translation. By the 12th century, European scholars were rediscovering philosophy, medicine, and science from Greece. So the idea of total amnesia is wrong. Rome was admired as a model of power and order. Greece was debated in lecture halls. Medieval people didn't live in a vacuum. They remembered and reinterpreted the ancient world in their own ways. Myth. Maps were useless scribbles. We sometimes picture medieval maps as nonsense. Seas full of monsters, lands drawn upside down, nothing practical at all. But maps had different purposes. Some were symbolic, like Mappe Mundi, which placed Jerusalem at the centre. These maps weren't for travel. They were teaching tools, showing a spiritual order of the world. Others were practical, like portolan charts used by sailors. These showed coastlines with remarkable accuracy. Compass roses and distances guided ships safely. So not all maps were the same. Some were theological illustrations. Others were functional instruments of navigation. The myth of useless scribbles ignores this variety. Medieval maps were reflections of both faith and function. Myth. People believed monsters lived at the edge of maps. The image of "Here be dragons" stamped on medieval maps is popular, but it tells us more about our imagination than theirs. It's true some maps decorated empty spaces with sea serpents, lions, or dog-headed men, but these were as much artistic flair as literal belief. Merchants and sailors knew lands and seas extended far beyond what they had charted. Stories from travellers blended fact with legend, and artists filled the unknown with creatures. Most people didn't actually expect to meet dog-headed tribes. The monsters symbolized mystery, danger, and the thrill of the unknown. So while maps looked fantastic, daily navigation was practical. The dragons guarded imagination, not geography. Myth. Galileo invented science. Galileo is celebrated as the father of modern science, but the idea that he invented it erases centuries of thought. Medieval scholars experimented with optics, astronomy, and motion. Roger Bacon tested lenses. Jean Buridan proposed theories of momentum long before Newton. Universities studied natural philosophy, a broad field of inquiry about the natural world. The scientific method was developing slowly, shaped by debate and experiment. Galileo's contribution was extraordinary. He refined methods, used telescopes to gather evidence, and boldly challenged authorities. But he stood on the shoulders of medieval thinkers. Science did not appear overnight in the Renaissance. It was already stirring in medieval classrooms, manuscripts, and workshops. Myth. Nobody questioned authority. We often imagine medieval people as submissive, never daring to question their rulers or priests, but history shows frequent challenges to power. Peasant revolts erupted in England, France, and elsewhere, demanding fairer treatment. Students at universities debated fiercely with professors. Monks resisted abbots, and reformers challenged church practices. Writers like William of Ockham criticised papal authority. Satirical plays mocked greedy officials. Villagers used songs and stories to air grievances. Open rebellion was dangerous, but silence was not the rule. The Middle Ages were alive with debates, protests, and questioning voices. So the myth of unquestioning obedience is far too simple. Medieval society was filled with argument and resistance. Myth: knights lived by strict chivalry. The romantic picture of a knight is of a flawless hero, noble, merciful, and honourable in all things. But the reality was far more complicated. Chivalry was an ideal, a code promoted in poems and manuals. Knights were told to protect the weak, defend the church, and fight with honour. Yet on the battlefield, those rules were often broken. Knights raided villages, took hostages, and fought as brutally as any soldier. The very fact that books of chivalry had to be written shows how far reality often strayed from the ideal. But the code mattered nonetheless. It shaped literature, culture, and the reputation knights wished to project. So knights were not perfect paladins, nor were they simple thugs. They lived in tension between the lofty ideals of chivalry and the harsh demands of war. Myth: swords were heavy and unwieldy. Movies often show knights heaving massive swords like iron clubs, but medieval swords were surprisingly light and agile. Most one-handed arming swords weighed 2 to 4 pounds. Even the largest two-handed greatswords rarely exceeded 6 or 7. They were crafted for balance, with tapered blades that allowed swift strikes and quick recovery. Training emphasized precision and control, not brute strength. The myth of impossibly heavy swords comes from ceremonial weapons or cheap replicas. Real swords were practical tools of war, sharp, versatile, and efficient. So the knight did not lumber with a burden of steel. He carried a finely tuned weapon built for speed and survival. Myth: chainmail was useless against weapons. Chainmail, thousands of interlocking iron rings, is sometimes dismissed as useless decoration, but it was an incredibly effective defense for centuries. Mail armor absorbed and spread the force of sword cuts and axe blows. It prevented deadly slashes, even if bruises remained. With padded clothing underneath, it protected soldiers from arrows and stabbing attempts. Only the strongest strikes or specialized weapons could pierce it. It was flexible too. Unlike rigid plate, mail allowed freedom of movement. Knights could run, climb, and fight with agility. The myth of useless chainmail ignores why it endured for hundreds of years. It was reliable, trusted, and life-saving. Myth: castles were impenetrable. We often imagine castles as perfect fortresses invincible against any attack, but history shows they could be captured. Their high walls and moats were formidable, but attackers adapted. Trebuchets hurled stones to shatter defences. Miners dug tunnels to collapse walls. Sieges starved defenders into surrender. Sometimes betrayal or bribery opened gates more effectively than force. Some castles held out for years. Others fell in days. Their strength depended on supplies, morale, and leadership as much as stone. So castles were strongholds, yes, but not unbreakable. They were part of an arms race, builders and besiegers constantly adapting. Myth. Everyone fought constantly. The Middle Ages are often painted as non-stop warfare. Every man a soldier, every field a battlefield. But daily life was far more peaceful. Wars did erupt, between lords, kings, or across nations. But most people spent their time farming, trading, and raising families. Villages went years without seeing a battle. Markets thrived, festivals filled calendars, and families planned for the future. When wars did come, they were devastating. But between them, life followed quieter rhythms of planting, harvest, and community. So the myth of endless fighting is misleading. Medieval life was not only swords and fire, it was also ploughs, prayers, and laughter. Myth. Catapults launched flaming cows. One of the most colourful myths of medieval warfare is that catapults hurled flaming cows or other animals into enemy castles. It's a striking image, a blazing beast sailing through the night sky. But history shows something different. Catapults and trebuchets were powerful siege engines. They hurled stones weighing hundreds of pounds to smash walls. Sometimes they launched smaller projectiles like jars filled with pitch, lime, or burning tar. There are accounts of diseased carcasses being used in sieges, yes. Rotting animals were flung over walls to spread fear or infection. But the flaming cow is more legend than reality. Engines were expensive, carefully built machines. Commanders wanted them used efficiently, not wastefully. A dead cow was less effective than a stone that could shatter a tower. So while siege warfare was brutal, it was also practical. Flaming livestock belong more to tall tales than actual tactics. Myth. Knights always jousted. Knights are often imagined spending their days jousting with lances in front of cheering crowds. But jousting was just one part of their world. Most of the time, knights served their lords, trained for war, or managed land. Jousts were special occasions linked to festivals, marriages, or royal visits. They were dangerous too. Broken bones and deaths were not uncommon even with blunted lances. Still, jousts were valued. They displayed bravery, horsemanship, and skill. Victories brought prestige, wealth, and sometimes romance. But the idea that knights were always in tournaments is false. For most, jousts were rare highlights, not everyday reality. Myth. Armour made knights clumsy. Hollywood often shows knights lumbering in armour, struggling to move, climb, or even stand up. But real armour was far more practical. A full suit of plate armour weighed 45 to 60 pounds. That may sound heavy, but the weight was distributed evenly across the body. Modern soldiers often carry more in gear. Knights trained to run, fight, and ride in armour. Accounts describe them vaulting into saddles or even performing somersaults during demonstrations. Poorly made replicas from later centuries helped fuel the myth of clumsiness. But battlefield armour was fitted, articulated, and designed for mobility. Knights weren't statues of steel. They were agile fighters, protected yet still able to move with speed and skill. Myth. Archers were always peasants. Another myth says that archers were lowly peasants while knights held all the glory, but archery was a respected and sometimes prestigious skill. In England, laws required men to practice the longbow on Sundays. This created armies of skilled archers whose power could decide battles. At Crécy and Agincourt, English archers devastated French knights. Their years of practice made them professionals, not expendable peasants. Some archers came from humble origins, yes, but many earned good wages, rewards, and honour for their service. So archers were not nameless rabble, they were essential soldiers shaping the course of medieval warfare. Myth: women never fought. The stereotype says women in the Middle Ages were entirely absent from battle, but history offers examples that prove otherwise. Noble women sometimes commanded castles during sieges. They organised defences, rallied troops, and made critical decisions. Joan of Arc is the most famous, leading armies with visions and determination. But she was not the only one. Chronicles mention women disguising themselves as men or joining battles alongside family. Women also contributed as strategists, suppliers, and healers. Their role in warfare was broader than simply waiting at home. So while women were fewer on the battlefield, they were not absent. They fought, led, and shaped the outcomes of conflicts in ways often forgotten. Myth: the church burned everyone who disagreed. It's often imagined that the medieval church burned anyone who questioned its teachings, but executions were rare compared to the myth. Yes, heresy was considered serious. The church investigated and punished it, but most cases ended with penance, prayer, or fines, not flames. The Inquisition, for example, often sought confession and reconciliation. Only in repeated or extreme cases did executions occur. Later writers exaggerated these events to paint the Middle Ages as especially cruel. The reality was more bureaucratic, with court hearings, witnesses, and negotiations. So while fear of punishment was real, the church did not burn everyone who disagreed. The myth is far harsher than the history. Myth: people believed witches could fly. The image of witches soaring on broomsticks feels medieval, but it's mostly later. In the early Middle Ages, church councils even declared that women claiming to fly at night were deceived by dreams or illusions. Authorities dismissed the idea as superstition. Magic was feared, yes. People worried about curses, charms, or harmful spells, but flight was not a central belief. It wasn't until the Renaissance and early modern witch hunts that broomstick flight became famous. In the Middle Ages, accusations focused more on sorcery or folk magic, not airborne journeys. So witches on broomsticks belong more to fairy tales than to medieval courts. Myth: the Inquisition killed millions. The Inquisition looms in memory as a reign of terror that slaughtered millions, but the numbers are far smaller. The medieval Inquisition began in the 13th century. Its trials were strict and intimidating, but most sentences were fines, pilgrimages, or public penance. Executions did occur, but in the thousands, not millions. The myth of vast numbers grew later, fueled by propaganda during Protestant Catholic conflicts. This does not excuse the cruelty or fear the Inquisition caused, but it places the scale in perspective. It was harsh, but not the extermination machine the myth describes. Myth: no one questioned faith. We often picture medieval people as blindly obedient to the church, never doubting, but questioning faith was common. Philosophers like Thomas Aquinas wrestled with reconciling reason and belief. Mystics described spiritual struggles. Ordinary villagers asked why God allowed famine or plague. Satirical plays mocked corrupt priests. Heretical groups like the Lollards openly challenged church teachings. So doubt and debate were part of religious life. Faith was strong, but it was not unquestioned. Medieval hearts carried both devotion and doubt, a balance familiar to us today. Myth. Pagan beliefs disappeared overnight. It's tempting to imagine Christianity sweeping across Europe instantly, erasing all old traditions. But conversion was gradual. Old customs lingered in festivals and folklore. Bonfires at midsummer, charms for protection, and harvest rituals survived alongside Christian practice. The church often blended the two. Feast days were placed on old festival dates. Pagan symbols were reinterpreted as Christian ones. For centuries people lived with a mix, praying to saints while remembering older rites. The transformation was slow, layered and complex, so paganism didn't vanish overnight. It adapted and left traces that can still be seen in traditions today. Myth, relics were all fake. Relics filled medieval churches, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, locks of hair, and even vials said to hold holy blood. It's tempting to think they were all frauds, but the truth is more nuanced. Yes, fakes existed. Merchants sold feathers as angel wings or bits of wood as sacred relics. Competition between churches encouraged exaggeration, but not all relics were invented. Many were genuine objects tied to beloved local saints. Whether authentic or not, they carried deep cultural weight. Relics drew pilgrims who donated money, helping fund cathedrals and hospitals. They inspired devotion, comforted the sick, and gave people a tangible connection to the divine. So while fraud was real, dismissing all relics as fake erases their meaning. They were symbols of faith and community, anchors of hope in a difficult world. Myth. People thought the apocalypse was always near. The stereotype is that medieval people lived in constant fear that the world was ending, but most balanced fear with hope. Apocalyptic preaching did surface in times of famine or plague. Some groups expected the end in the year 1000 or after disasters. But most people planned for the long term. Cathedrals took centuries to build. Families passed on land, and villages planted orchards that would take years to bear fruit. The end of days was a concern, yes, but it was not the sole focus of daily life. People lived with a balance of vigilance and steady planning for tomorrow. So while sermons warned of the Last Judgment, most medieval lives were not paralyzed by constant fear. They lived as we do, with one eye on eternity and the other on the next harvest. Myth. All priests were corrupt. Stories often paint medieval priests as greedy or lazy, but corruption was not universal. Many parish priests lived modestly, serving small villages. They baptized children, married couples, and comforted the dying. Their lives were closer to poverty than wealth. Yes, some higher-ranking clergy grew rich. Yes, abuses existed. But the stereotype of universal corruption ignores the countless priests who devoted themselves to their communities. Reform movements like the Franciscans show that people expected sincerity and holiness. When corruption happened, it was criticised precisely because it broke the norm. So the image of all priests as schemers is misleading. Most were neighbours, teachers and guides respected in their villages. Myth. Everyone feared hell constantly. Hellfire sermons did echo in churches, but medieval life was not a constant panic about damnation. Alongside warnings of hell, people also heard of heaven, saints, and forgiveness. Festivals celebrated joy, hope, and community. Confession, prayer, and charity gave reassurance. Faith was not only about fear, it was also about comfort and promise. Medieval people laughed, planned, and dreamed of the future. They lived with both caution and hope. So the myth of endless terror is unfair. Faith inspired both trembling and trust, as complex then as it is now. Myth. The Dark Ages were totally dark. Perhaps the greatest myth of all is that the Middle Ages were nothing but ignorance, a dark age. Yes, Rome's collapse brought hardship, but medieval Europe also saw growth, innovation, and light. Cathedrals rose with stained glass glowing like jewels. Universities flourished. Music, poetry, and philosophy blossomed. Inventions like the windmill, eyeglasses, and mechanical clocks appeared. Trade expanded, connecting continents. The label Dark Ages was invented later by Renaissance writers who wanted to glorify their own age. It unfairly dismisses centuries of achievement. The Middle Ages were not dark. They were complex and full of hardship, yes, but also full of colour, creativity, and humanity. Myth. Medieval women couldn't read or write. It's often assumed that medieval women were completely illiterate, but records show many women could and did read and write. Noble women were often educated, especially in convents. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Isabella of Castile were highly literate and politically skilled. Even in middle-class households, daughters sometimes learned to read religious texts or manage accounts. There are manuscripts copied in the hands of nuns. Poems and letters written by women survive. Christine de Pizan, for example, became a professional writer in the 15th century. While literacy rates were lower for women than men, the idea of complete exclusion is false. Women valued education when opportunities arose and many families supported it. So the myth of entirely illiterate women erases a history of female readers, writers and thinkers who left their mark on the Middle Ages. Myth. Medieval people didn't care about animals. The stereotype says medieval people treated animals only as tools, but evidence shows care and compassion. Horses, dogs, and cats were treasured companions. Knights valued their war horses so deeply that some were given ceremonial burials. Hunting dogs were named and praised in poems. Cats kept in homes appear in manuscript illustrations curled by the fire. Peasants cared for cows, goats, and chickens as vital sources of milk, eggs, and livelihood. While animals were used for labour, they were also respected for survival. Folktales and saints' lives describe animals with affection. Saint Francis famously preached to birds. Other saints were said to heal or befriend wild creatures, so while medieval attitudes were practical, animals mattered. They were companions, workers, and symbols of the sacred woven into daily life. Myth. Medieval warfare was always noble and chivalrous. Stories often paint medieval battles as tournaments of honour, with knights saluting before duels, but real warfare was brutal and rarely noble. Knights raided villages, burned crops and took hostages. Armies looted towns and spread terror as a strategy. Sieges starved entire populations. Chivalry was an ideal promoted in poetry, but it was often ignored in practice. Prisoners could be ransomed, but peasants had little protection. War was messy, violent, and cruel. That said, rituals of honour existed. Knights sometimes did follow codes, sparing noble opponents or showing mercy in tournaments. But to think every battle was chivalrous is to mistake propaganda for reality. Medieval warfare was a mix of ideals and atrocities, not a stage play of honour. Myth. Medieval architecture was all the same. We often picture medieval buildings as identical grey castles and cathedrals, but architecture was astonishingly varied. Romanesque churches with rounded arches gave way to soaring Gothic cathedrals filled with stained glass. Castles evolved from wooden Motte and Bailey structures to elaborate stone fortresses with towers and moats. Vernacular buildings also varied. In Italy, bright painted townhouses lined piazzas. In Germany, half-timbered houses gave towns distinctive character. England's cottages used thatch, while French villages used tile. Medieval builders experimented with vaulting, flying buttresses and ribbed ceilings. Each region expressed culture through its architecture. So the myth of sameness misses the point. The Middle Ages were filled with diverse styles, creative, colourful and distinct. Myth. The printing press ended the Middle Ages overnight. It's often said that when Gutenberg invented the press, the medieval world ended instantly, but change was gradual. Handwritten manuscripts continued to be produced for decades. Monks copied texts even as printed books spread. Illuminated manuscripts were still prized by the wealthy. Printing did revolutionize knowledge. Books became cheaper, literacy spread, and ideas travelled faster. But medieval traditions blended with the new technology for generations. The Middle Ages didn't end with the press alone. It was part of broader shifts: economic growth, exploration, and cultural change. So the press marked a turning point, but not an overnight revolution. Medieval and modern worlds overlapped for centuries. Myth. Medieval music was just monks chanting. The image of medieval music is endless monotone chanting in echoing chapels, but music was far more diverse. Yes, Gregorian chant was important in churches, but there were also polyphonic compositions with rich harmonies written by composers like Hildegard of Bingen. Secular music flourished. Troubadours sang love songs in courts. Minstrels performed ballads in villages. Instruments like lutes, harps, drums and bagpipes filled feasts with sound. Dancing songs and playful tunes survive in manuscripts showing lively rhythms. Music was part of weddings, markets and celebrations, so the myth of endless chanting misses the joy. Medieval life pulsed with melodies both sacred and playful. Myth. Monks only prayed and never worked. Monks are often imagined as kneeling all day in silent chapels, but monasteries were busy, practical communities. Yes, monks prayed at regular hours, but they also worked fields, brewed beer, copied manuscripts and cared for the sick. Some monasteries became centres of farming innovation. Others ran schools, hospitals and libraries. Manual labour was considered part of devotion. The rule of St. Benedict stressed ora et labora, prayer and work. So monks weren't idle. They were spiritual farmers, scholars, healers and craftsmen shaping medieval society in countless ways. Myth. Law was just whatever a king wanted. It's easy to picture medieval kings ruling by whim, making laws on a whim. But legal systems were more structured. Customary law guided villages for generations. Local courts settled disputes with juries of neighbours. Church courts handled marriages, wills and moral issues. Kings could issue decrees, yes, but they relied on charters, councils and established traditions. Documents like Magna Carta show that even monarchs faced limits. So medieval law was a patchwork of customs, courts and royal authority. It wasn't random tyranny, it was evolving justice rooted in precedent. Myth. Medieval people had terrible teeth and no care. It's often assumed that medieval mouths were full of rotten stumps, but dental evidence tells another story. Medieval diets had less refined sugar than today. As a result, cavities were less common than in modern times. People cleaned their teeth with twigs, cloths and herbal powders. Recipes survive for rinses made from mint, sage or vinegar. Yes, dental care was limited. Abscesses and toothaches were painful realities, but teeth were often healthier than stereotypes suggest. So medieval people did not all suffer from rotting mouths. They practiced care and hygiene with the knowledge they had. Myth. People didn't care about time until modern clocks. The idea that medieval people drifted without time is misleading. They cared deeply about hours and rhythms. Church bells rang to mark prayer times throughout the day. Villagers set routines around sunrise, sunset, and the cycle of work. Markets and fairs kept precise schedules. By the 13th century, mechanical clocks appeared in towers, striking hours for entire towns. Sundials and water clocks were already in use. Time mattered for farming, for contracts, and for worship. People lived by calendars filled with feast days and fasts. So the myth of timeless peasants is false. The medieval world ticked with bells, shadows, and clocks long before the modern age. Myth. People slept in one long block at night. Today we assume sleep should last in one solid stretch. But medieval sleep patterns were different. Many people followed segmented sleep. They would rest for a first sleep, wake for an hour or two, and then return to bed for a second sleep. During that middle period, people prayed, tended fires, visited neighbours, or even worked quietly. References to first and second sleep appear in letters, medical texts and literature. This rhythm fit a world without electric light. Darkness encouraged shorter cycles of rest and wakefulness, so the myth of one unbroken night's sleep doesn't apply to the Middle Ages. Their nights were divided with rest woven naturally into the rhythm of the dark. Myth. Medieval banquets were constant feasts of meat. We picture medieval nobles gorging on endless roasted boars, but feasting was occasional, not constant. Banquets celebrated weddings, victories, or major holidays. Daily meals were simpler, even for lords. Bread, pottage, fish, and seasonal vegetables made up most diets. Meat was eaten, but often salted, smoked, or stewed to last through the year. Fresh roasts were for rare occasions. Peasants, meanwhile, ate mostly grains, beans and dairy, with meat as a luxury. Fasting rules from the church also restricted meat on many days. So while great halls sometimes rang with feasts, everyday medieval diets were modest. The endless banquet is more legend than life. Myth, medieval people. Had no sense of privacy, we imagine medieval life as completely communal, with no personal space. But privacy did exist in different ways. Castles had private chambers for nobles. Monasteries offered small cells for monks. Even peasants created corners in homes for family or prayer. Bathhouses sometimes had partitions. People used curtains or screens to divide space. Letters and confessions reveal a desire for personal thoughts to remain private. Privacy wasn't modern, no locked bedrooms with do not disturb signs. But medieval people valued solitude, secrecy and boundaries in their own ways. So the myth of a world without privacy is exaggerated. People sought moments of separation, even in a crowded age. Myth, medieval people. Thought maps were flat fantasies. It's often said medieval maps were useless doodles full of monsters and mistakes, but maps served many purposes. Some were symbolic, showing Jerusalem at the centre of the world, teaching spiritual truths. Others, like Portolan charts, gave sailors remarkably accurate coastlines for navigation. Decorations of sea serpents or dog-headed men were not always literal beliefs. They represented mystery, danger and artistry. Travellers knew more of the world than these flat fantasies suggest. Maps mixed knowledge, imagination and faith. So the myth of worthless maps misses the balance. Medieval charts reflected both wonder and precision. Myth. Medieval medicine was all bloodletting. The stereotype says every illness was treated by draining blood. But medieval medicine was broader. Yes, bloodletting was practiced based on balancing humours, but doctors also prescribed herbs, diets, baths and rest. Surgeons performed wound care, bone setting and even cataract surgery. Medical texts drew on Greek, Roman and Arabic knowledge. Hospitals cared for the sick, not only with bleeding but with food and cleanliness. Folk remedies also flourished. Honey for wounds, garlic for infections, lavender for sleep. So while bloodletting existed, medicine was more varied than the caricature suggests. It was imperfect, but not a single crude method. Myth. Medieval people didn't care about childhood. We sometimes hear that children were treated as small adults, without care or affection. But medieval families valued children deeply. Paintings show parents playing with their children. Books of hours include prayers for their protection. Legal records show guardianship and inheritance rights designed to safeguard them. Yes, childhood was shorter. Children worked young and faced high mortality, but that made them more precious, not less. Folk tales, toys and songs reveal care and joy. Teachers and clerics debated how best to educate the young. So the myth of indifferent parents is wrong. Medieval childhood was difficult but also cherished. Myth. Medieval warfare was all knights on horses. Popular culture shows endless jousts and cavalry charges, but medieval armies were more complex. Infantry made up the bulk of forces, spearmen, crossbowmen and archers. Siege engineers built towers, trebuchets and catapults. Naval battles raged with boarding actions and fire ships. Knights on horseback were important, but not the whole picture. peasant levies and professional foot soldiers carried much of the fighting. So warfare was not only glittering knights, it was mud, arrows, engines, and masses of ordinary men. Myth. Medieval people never washed their clothes. The image of people wearing filthy rags for years is exaggerated. Laundry was part of medieval life. Women washed clothes in rivers, ponds, and communal washhouses. Soap made from animal fat and lye was available. Ash, sand, and herbs were also used. Records mention laundresses as a profession in towns. Wealthy households had dedicated servants for washing and bleaching linens. Clothing did get dirty more quickly, and washing was labour-intensive, but it was still done regularly. So the myth of never washed clothes is unfair. Clean garments mattered for health, comfort, and dignity. Myth. The Middle Ages were culturally isolated. It's tempting to see medieval Europe as cut off from the wider world, but it was connected by vast networks. Merchants carried silk, spices, and ideas from Asia along the Silk Road. The Islamic world transmitted knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. African kingdoms traded gold and ivory with European markets. Travellers like Marco Polo journeyed east. Pilgrims crossed borders constantly. Ideas flowed with goods and people. So the myth of isolation is false. The Middle Ages were a crossroads where cultures blended and inspired one another. Myth. Medieval people believed in a flat universe with Earth at the bottom. The picture of medieval cosmology is often simplified to a flat universe with Earth sinking at the bottom. But their view was more structured and imaginative. Scholars believed in a spherical Earth, placed at the centre of concentric spheres. The moon, sun, planets and stars were thought to circle in crystal heavens. This geocentric model came from Aristotle and Ptolemy. Far from flat, the universe was layered like an onion, vast, ordered and complex. Its movements were tied to philosophy, theology and observation of the skies. So while not accurate by modern science, the medieval cosmos was not a flat fantasy. It was a grand design, a framework for meaning as well as astronomy. Myth. Medieval castles were always cold, damp dungeons. Castles are often imagined as freezing prisons of stone, but many were warmer and more comfortable than the stereotype suggests. Great halls blazed with hearth fires. Tapestries and carpets insulated walls and floors. Windows were covered with shutters or even early glass. Private chambers had feather beds, furs and braziers. Kitchens produced hot meals daily. Servants kept fires going, and architecture improved across centuries. Yes, castles could be drafty and smoky, especially older ones, but they were not endless dungeons. They were homes, fortresses, and centres of power. Myth. Medieval people thought illness was only punishment from God. It's true that sin and divine punishment were seen as causes of disease, but medicine also had practical foundations. Doctors studied humours, blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. They prescribed diets, herbs and rest. Monks kept herb gardens for remedies. Leprosy, plague and fevers were explained spiritually at times, but also treated physically. Hospitals offered care and attempted hygiene. So illness was not only seen as punishment, it was a mystery attacked from both faith and reason. Myth. Peasants had no sense of style. The stereotype shows peasants in endless rags without colour or flair, but clothing was more varied. Wool and linen were common, dyed with plants into reds, blues and greens. Festivals encouraged bright costumes, ribbons and embroidery. Shoes, belts and hats were crafted with care. Even poorer people took pride in neat, clean clothing. Second-hand garments circulated, allowing access to finer styles. So while nobles flaunted luxury silks, peasants were not styleless. They dressed with colour, creativity and identity. Myth. Medieval people believed the world was about to end at the year 1000. Popular stories say people panicked as the year 1000 approached, expecting apocalypse. But evidence of widespread fear is thin. Some sermons and chronicles mentioned the possibility of judgment, yet most communities marked the new millennium with routine records of harvests and taxes. The idea of mass hysteria was exaggerated centuries later by writers. Medieval Christians believed in an eventual end, but not everyone tied it neatly to 1000. So the myth of apocalyptic terror at the millennium is overstated. For most, life simply continued into the next century. Myth. Medieval people believed all cats were evil or demonic. It's sometimes claimed cats were universally feared as witches' companions. But the relationship was more mixed. Cats were kept in homes and barns to control mice and rats. They appear in manuscripts, sometimes playfully curled at the feet of scholars. Yes, in some places cats were linked to superstition, and persecutions occurred. But in many others, they were valued and cared for. So cats were not seen as purely demonic. They were companions, hunters and symbols, both feared and loved. Myth. People in the Middle Ages didn't travel beyond Europe. The myth suggests medieval life was locked inside Europe's borders, but long-distance journeys did happen. Viking sailors reached Iceland, Greenland and even North America. Merchants of Venice traded in Constantinople and the Middle East. The Silk Road connected Europe with Asia. Pilgrims and diplomats reached Jerusalem, Cairo, and even the Mongol courts. By the 13th century, Marco Polo described China to European readers, so medieval horizons stretched farther than we think. Their footsteps and ships carried them across continents. Myth. Medieval knights were always noble heroes. Legends paint knights as perfect defenders of virtue, but reality was more brutal. Knights swore to codes of chivalry, but many ignored them. They raided villages, fought for wealth, and joined bloody feuds. Some were admired champions, others were feared bullies with swords and titles. The fact that stories celebrated ideals shows how far practice often strayed. Knights were human, sometimes heroic, often flawed. Myth. Everyone ate with their hands only, no utensils. We imagine medieval diners grabbing food with bare hands, but utensils were common. Spoons and knives were widely used. Guests often brought their own personal knives. Wooden bowls, trenchers of bread, and shared platters held meals. Forks were rarer in early centuries, but by the late Middle Ages, nobles in Italy and beyond used them regularly. So meals were not pure finger-feeding chaos. Utensils, manners, and rituals shaped the table. Myth. Castles were constantly under siege. Stories often make it seem like castles were under attack day and night. In truth, most castles spent far more time in peace than in war. Yes, castles were built for defence. High walls, towers and moats prepared them for danger. But maintaining a castle was expensive, and lords preferred to rule and collect rents rather than sit under siege. When sieges did happen, they were dramatic and destructive. Trebuchets hurled stones, tunnels collapsed walls, and starvation forced surrenders. But these events were rare compared to the daily business of governing, feasting, and farming. So castles were symbols of security, not constant battlegrounds. Most of their stones stood quietly, watching over peaceful landscapes. Myth. The Middle Ages were a time without books. The myth says books vanished in the Middle Ages, leaving a void of learning, but books were very much alive. Monks copied manuscripts in scriptoria, filling shelves with theology, law, poetry, and science. Universities grew libraries where students shared and debated ideas. Books were expensive, yes, since each was handwritten, but nobles and merchants owned them, churches read from them, and travellers carried them. Illuminated manuscripts show how much care and beauty was poured into their making. Pages glittered with gold leaf and painted saints. So the Middle Ages were not bookless. They were an age of parchment, ink, and the quiet scratch of quills. Myth. Medieval clothing was always rough and uncomfortable. We often picture peasants in scratchy sacks and nobles in stiff, heavy robes. But medieval clothing was crafted with comfort in mind. Peasants wore wool and linen tailored into tunics, hose, and cloaks. They dyed them in reds, blues, and greens with natural plants. Nobles had silks, velvets, and furs. These were not only symbols of status, but also warm and soft. Tailors cut garments carefully to allow freedom of movement. Even armour was padded with quilted clothing designed to prevent chafing. Special outfits were made for festivals, weddings, and holidays. So medieval people dressed with practicality and pride. Their wardrobes were more colourful and comfortable than the myth suggests. Myth. People believed the sun revolved around the earth because they were ignorant. It's easy to dismiss the geocentric model as simple ignorance, but it was based on centuries of careful observation. When people looked at the sky, they saw the sun rise and set, the stars move in circles, and planets wander slowly. It made sense to place Earth at the centre. Astronomers like Ptolemy built complex systems of spheres and calculations to explain the motions. These models were impressive and predictive, even if not correct. So people weren't foolish. They were working with the tools and evidence they had. Heliocentrism came later, but medieval astronomy was a genuine attempt to understand the heavens. Myth. Medieval warfare was just endless sword fights. Films often show battles as duels of clashing swords stretching for hours, but warfare was more diverse. Bows, crossbows, and pikes were common on battlefields. Siege engines decided wars as often as swordplay. Tactics included ambushes, fortifications, and supply lines. Strategy, not just brute force, won campaigns. Swords were important symbols of knighthood, but most soldiers fought with spears or bows. Cavalry charges, artillery bombardments, and even diplomacy shaped outcomes. So medieval war was not just endless dueling. It was complex, costly, and fought with many tools beyond the sword. Myth. Medieval people didn't use money, only barter. It's often claimed that medieval markets ran only on trade. Grain for wool, pigs for tools. But coins circulated widely. Kings minted silver pennies, florins, and ducats that crossed borders. Merchants paid tolls, bought goods, and lent money with coins. Yes, Barter still happened in villages, especially during shortages, but towns thrived on cash economies. Guilds and markets recorded transactions with precise values. So medieval people were no strangers to money. They jingled coins in their purses just as we do today. Myth. All medieval towns were dirty and crowded. The myth paints every town as a stinking mess of filth and disease, but towns varied greatly. Streets could be narrow and busy, but markets, fountains and wells brought order. Some cities had regulations about waste disposal and street cleaning. Yes, sanitation was limited compared to today, but not every street was a sewer, and people valued cleanliness. Gardens, courtyards and churches gave towns open spaces. So towns were mixed, bustling, noisy, sometimes dirty, but also vibrant centres of trade and community. Myth. Women couldn't own businesses or work trades. The image of women shut out of commerce ignores the records. Women brewed ale, sold goods and managed shops. Widows often inherited their husbands' trades, keeping businesses running. In textiles and food, women worked as guild members or independent producers. Noble women managed estates, signed contracts and oversaw finances. Some even ran shipping or trading ventures. So while barriers existed, women were not absent from work. They built livelihoods with resilience and skill. Myth. Medieval people believed in astrology blindly. Astrology was respected but not unquestioned. Kings and nobles consulted astrologers for advice. Physicians checked the stars before treatments. Farmers marked calendars with celestial signs. But many also doubted it. Church leaders criticized astrologers who claimed to predict salvation or fate. Scholars debated how much influence the stars truly had. So astrology was influential but not blindly followed. It was one thread in a larger tapestry of belief and inquiry. Myth. People thought thunder and lightning were only caused by magic. The idea that medieval people saw every storm as sorcery is exaggerated. Some did believe storms were divine punishment or caused by witches, but natural explanations also circulated. Aristotle's works, taught in universities, described lightning as heat and fire in the sky. Farmers and sailors respected storms as natural dangers, not just magical terrors. Prayers for protection were common, but so were practical precautions. So while magic was part of the picture, it wasn't the only explanation. Thunder and lightning inspired fear, awe, and curiosity, not blind superstition. Myth. The Middle Ages were a time of constant famine. The myth says people in the Middle Ages starved endlessly, scraping by on crumbs. But while famines did strike, they were not constant. Bad harvests from cold weather or floods could bring hunger. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 left deep scars across Europe. Yet most years provided enough grain, vegetables and livestock for survival. Peasants stored grain in barns, salted meat and brewed ale to preserve calories. Markets traded surplus food, while lords kept granaries for hard times. Famine was a recurring danger, yes, but it was not everyday life. Most medieval families ate bread, cheese and pottage daily, hearty meals, not constant starvation. Myth. Peasants had no free time or festivals. The stereotype imagines peasants working from dawn to dusk without rest. But their lives included festivals, holy days, and leisure. The church calendar marked dozens of feast days when work stopped. villages celebrated with games, music, and dancing. Seasonal fairs filled towns with merchants and entertainers. Winter evenings brought storytelling, dice, and songs around the hearth. Peasants worked hard, yes, especially at planting and harvest, but they carved out time for joy. Their lives balanced toil with moments of laughter and rest. Myth. People never travelled at night because of fear of spirits. It's said that medieval travellers refused to walk after dark, fearing ghosts and demons. While caution was real, night travel wasn't impossible. Roads were dangerous from thieves, not just spirits. Torches, lanterns, and the moon lit the way for those who needed to move. Pilgrims sometimes pressed on at night to reach a shrine. Messengers and merchants travelled after sunset when urgency demanded. Stories of spirits served as warnings, yes, but they didn't stop movement. Night travel was risky, but not forbidden. Myth. Medieval warfare was just chaos with no strategy. Films show medieval battles as mobs colliding wildly, but commanders used real strategy and planning. Armies arranged in lines, flanks, and reserves. Signals from horns, drums, or banners kept order. Fortifications, ambushes, and supply lines all mattered. At Agincourt, the English used terrain and longbows to devastating effect. Medieval warfare was brutal, yes, but it was not random brawling. It relied on tactics as well as courage. Myth. People believed all illness was caused by bad smells alone. The miasma theory claimed foul air carried sickness. It was influential in the Middle Ages, but not the only explanation. Doctors also studied humours, diet, and the influence of the stars. They observed symptoms, prescribed herbs, and recommended balance in daily life. During the Black Death, some blamed stinking air. Others pointed to contagion or divine punishment. Responses mixed spiritual and practical measures. So people did not think smells alone caused illness. They explored multiple theories in their search to heal. Myth. Everyone was deeply religious with no skeptics. The Middle Ages are often painted as purely pious, with no doubts allowed. Religion was central, yes, but skepticism existed. Satirical poems mocked greedy monks. Tales joked about priests and miracles. Philosophers debated free will, reason, and faith. Some peasants and nobles resisted church taxes or challenged authority. Heretical movements like the Cathars or Lollards show people sought alternatives. So while religion shaped culture deeply, not everyone followed blindly. The medieval world held questions as well as faith. Myth. Medieval people didn't value beauty or art. Another myth says medieval life was grey, ugly, and joyless, but beauty filled their world. Cathedrals soared with stained glass windows glowing in coloured light. Manuscripts shimmered with gold leaf and intricate borders. Peasants decorated homes with painted patterns and carved tools with care. Clothing was dyed bright reds, blues, and yellows. Art was everywhere, on church walls, in jewellery, in song and dance. Medieval people valued beauty as a way to honour God, delight the senses, and express joy. Myth. The Middle Ages were a single monolithic culture. It's tempting to lump the Middle Ages into one block, but Europe was diverse and dynamic. French knights, Italian merchants, English peasants, and Moorish scholars lived different lives. Languages, customs, and laws varied from village to village. trade routes brought spices from Asia, science from the Arab world, and stories from Africa. The Middle Ages were connected, not uniform, so instead of one culture, it was a patchwork of many, woven together in surprising ways. Myth. Medieval people didn't value beauty or art. The myth suggests the Middle Ages were dull and colourless. People imagine grey stone walls, plain clothes, and lives without beauty. But medieval Europe was bursting with creativity. Cathedrals soared with stained glass windows glowing in sunlight like jewels. Monks decorated manuscripts with golden letters, painted vines, and tiny animals dancing in the margins. Villagers painted their homes with bright lime washes. Markets were filled with colourful fabrics, dyed reds, blues, and greens. Tapestries told stories of battles, romances, and saints. Even spoons, belt buckles, and pottery carried patterns and designs. Art was not just for kings or nobles, it reached every corner of society. Music too filled the air. From church choirs to travelling minstrels, songs were part of both sacred and ordinary life. Festivals brought theatre and dance to villages. Storytellers and poets entertained by firelight. Beauty was woven into every season, from spring maypoles to Christmas pageants. Medieval people valued art not as a luxury, but as a reflection of life. It connected faith, joy, and community. Far from being an age without beauty, it was an age that lived through it. Myth. The Middle Ages were a single monolithic culture. It is easy to imagine the Middle Ages as one uniform world. The word medieval makes us think of a single culture stretching across centuries, but Europe was a patchwork of languages, customs, and traditions. France was not England, and Italy was not Germany. Even within a single kingdom, towns and villages had unique ways of life. Clothing styles shifted dramatically from region to region. Food, too, was influenced by geography. Mediterranean diets of olive oil and fish were different from northern stews of meat and butter. Religious practice varied, with local saints and regional festivals shaping devotion. Dialects change from one valley to the next, sometimes making neighbours sound like foreigners. Trade and travel only deepened these differences. Merchants brought spices from the east, ideas from the Arab world, and stories from distant lands. Cultural exchange was constant, blending old and new. Medieval life was not static or uniform, it was dynamic, diverse, and rich. So the Middle Ages were not one monolithic culture. They were a quilt of many colours stitched together by both difference and connection. Myth. Medieval people never used forks. The myth says forks were absent from medieval tables. In truth, forks appeared in the Byzantine Empire and spread into Italy by the 11th century. Nobles in Venice and Florence used them, though at first they were considered unusual. Some churchmen even criticised forks as decadent, but gradually they became more accepted. By the 14th and 15th centuries, forks appeared in France and other courts. The wealthy enjoyed them alongside knives and spoons. For ordinary people, bread and fingers were still the main tools, but forks were not unknown. As trade and travel spread customs, forks slowly became part of dining culture. Forks made eating cleaner, especially for sticky or messy dishes. They also signalled refinement and etiquette. Writers began describing them as symbols of manners and elegance. The transition from hands to utensils was not sudden, it was gradual and uneven. So while not every peasant used a fork at dinner, it is wrong to imagine they did not exist. The medieval fork was the ancestor of the one we use daily, born not in the Renaissance but in the Middle Ages. Myth. All medieval bridges were falling apart. The myth paints medieval bridges as crumbling and unsafe. But in truth, many were remarkable feats of engineering. Communities, monasteries and rulers invested heavily in building them. Stone bridges were carefully designed to last for centuries. Some still stand today, like London Bridge and the Pont Valentré in Cahors. Wooden bridges also served towns and villages. These needed repairs more often, but they were essential for trade and travel. Bridge maintenance became a civic duty, with guilds and confraternities raising money to keep them strong. Pilgrims, merchants, and armies all depended on safe crossings. Bridges were more than practical. They symbolized connection between regions, markets, and even heaven and earth. Chapel towers sometimes rose at their centers, blessing travelers as they passed. Art and architecture made them landmarks of civic pride. So bridges were not ruins, they were living structures, maintained and celebrated. Medieval bridges carried life across rivers, binding communities together. Myth. Medieval people thought owls were always evil omens. The myth claims medieval people only feared owls. It is true some saw them as symbols of death or misfortune. Because they flew at night and called in darkness, they seemed mysterious. Chronicles sometimes described owls as warnings of coming disaster. But the story is more complex. Owls also symbolized wisdom, especially in connection with the ancient goddess Athena. In manuscripts, monks painted them as watchful creatures. Farmers respected owls for keeping fields free of rats and mice. Their presence could mean safety for crops. Folklore mixed fear with admiration. In some tales, owls were guides to hidden knowledge. In others, they were seen as protectors of the night. Rather than being purely evil, they held a dual role in imagination. So medieval people did not all see owls as dark omens. They saw them with a mix of awe, fear and respect, much as we still do today. Myth. Only nobles could drink wine. The myth says wine was reserved only for kings and nobles. In truth, wine was common in regions where grapes grew naturally. Monasteries cultivated vineyards, producing wine for religious services and daily use. Towns had taverns where ordinary people could drink cheap local wine. The quality of wine varied depending on wealth. Nobles imported refined wines from distant regions, aging them carefully in cellars. Peasants and townsfolk drank simpler, watered-down versions or sour wines pressed from local harvests. Even children often drank diluted wine mixed with water, since it was safer than stagnant water. In northern Europe, where grapes were harder to grow, ale and beer were more common. But this did not mean wine was unknown. It was traded across the continent. Merchants sold barrels to markets, and pilgrims often tasted wine in foreign lands. Wine was a drink of everyday life, not only the privilege of elites. So while nobles may have enjoyed finer vintages, they did not monopolize the drink. Wine was woven into the rhythm of medieval meals, rituals, and celebrations across all classes. Myth. Medieval people never swam or knew how to swim. The myth imagines medieval people as fearful of water, avoiding it completely. But swimming was known and practiced in many regions. Medieval manuscripts even describe swimming techniques, showing figures paddling in rivers. Soldiers valued the ability to swim, using it to cross rivers during campaigns. Children often learned by playing in ponds and streams during the summer. In warmer climates, swimming was a common pastime. Some cities even designated bathing areas along rivers for communal use. Swimming was not universal, but it was far from unknown. Writers sometimes praise swimming as a skill of strength and discipline. Norse sagas celebrated heroes who swam long distances. In medieval tournaments, demonstrations of swimming were even considered feats of endurance. Practicality and enjoyment both encouraged people to learn. So while not every villager was a strong swimmer, the skill was alive and valued. Medieval people like us knew the joy and usefulness of moving through water. Myth. All castles had secret tunnels everywhere. Legends often imagine castles filled with winding hidden passages. Stories of daring escapes and hidden doors make them sound like labyrinths. But in reality, secret tunnels were rare. Most castles relied on walls, towers, and gates for defense, not underground escape routes. Some castles did have sally ports, small hidden doors used for surprise attacks or escapes. A few had passages leading to nearby rivers or forests, but these were the exception, not the rule. Building elaborate underground systems was costly, dangerous, and impractical. The myth grew from Romance literature and later Gothic tales. Writers loved to imagine secret doors and candlelit tunnels. Victorian visitors to ruins exaggerated such features, adding mystery to old stones. Popular imagination carried the idea further than history supports. So while some tunnels did exist, they were not a universal feature. Real castles were designed for strength, not for fantasy mazes. Myth. Medieval people thought comets always brought disaster. The myth says comets were only seen as omens of doom. It is true that many chroniclers connected them with famine, plague, or war. Their sudden appearance in the sky seemed alarming, unfamiliar, and powerful. Stories tell of rulers trembling at their arrival. But not all interpretations were fearful. Some saw comets as wonders of God's creation, meant to inspire awe rather than terror. Astronomers recorded their paths carefully, treating them as natural phenomena worth study. Islamic and Byzantine scholars also shared observations, which later influenced European thinkers. By the late Middle Ages, records of comets became more systematic. Instead of vague omens, they were tracked as celestial events. Even when people feared them, they also wondered and learned. Comets became subjects of curiosity as well as superstition. So while comets stirred anxiety, they were never only doom. They sparked imagination, faith, and the earliest steps towards scientific study. Myth. Peasants never travelled for pilgrimages. The myth suggests long pilgrimages were only for nobles or clergy. In reality, peasants too set out on journeys of devotion. Shrines like Canterbury in England or Santiago de Compostela in Spain drew people of all classes. Pilgrimages were acts of faith, healing, and penance. Villagers often saved money for months or years to make the trip. They travelled in groups for safety, sharing food and companionship along the road. Some journeys were local, to nearby chapels or holy wells. Others stretched across countries, sometimes lasting years. Pilgrimages created meeting places where peasants, merchants, and nobles mingled. They brought cultural exchange, songs, and stories back to villages. For many peasants, A pilgrimage was the greatest journey of their lives. It connected them to the wider world in the ways nothing else could. So far from staying in one place, peasants often walked long miles of faith. Their steps helped shape the spiritual and cultural map of medieval Europe. Myth: medieval people never used soap. The myth claims medieval people had no soap, living in filth. But soap made from animal fat and lye was widely used across Europe. Manuscripts from as early as the 9th century include recipes for soap making. In Mediterranean regions, olive oil soaps were prized for their softness. Soap was not always gentle. Some mixtures were harsh, used mostly for clothes, but others were scented with herbs or rosewater, used for bathing. But the late Middle Ages, soap making had grown into an organised craft. Cities like Marseille and Naples became famous for producing high-quality bars. Even monasteries produced soap, supplying communities and hospitals. Records show soap purchases by ordinary townsfolk, not just the wealthy. While peasants may have bathed less often, soap was part of everyday cleaning. It helped wash clothing, scrub tools, and maintain hygiene. So the idea of a soapless Middle Ages is false. Medieval people valued cleanliness, and soap was one of their trusted tools. Myth: medieval kings had unlimited power. The myth paints medieval kings as absolute rulers, commanding anything at will. In reality, their power was balanced by nobles, the church, and custom. A king who ignored the rights of lords or towns risked rebellion. Charters like Magna Carta in 1215 show that kings were forced to share authority. Even taxation required negotiation. Kings often called assemblies of nobles and clergy to gain consent. Parliaments in England and estates in France emerged from these gatherings. Power was never one-sided, it was always contested. The church also held enormous influence. Popes could excommunicate rulers, cutting them off from legitimacy. Local bishops and abbots commanded wealth and loyalty that rivaled royal control. Kings had to negotiate constantly, not dictate unopposed. So the image of a king as an unquestioned tyrant is misleading. Medieval monarchy was fragile, dependent on compromise, alliances, and persuasion. Myth: medieval people never saw the world beyond their parish church. The myth suggests peasants lived and died within sight of one church. But many people travelled farther than that. Markets drew villagers into towns, sometimes days away. Fairs and festivals created bustling crossroads where distant communities mingled. Pilgrimages carried even peasants across regions and countries. Young apprentices left home to train in cities. Marriages linked families between villages, creating webs of travel. Wars too moved soldiers and refugees across wide territories. Even those who stayed close to home heard tales from travellers. Merchants brought news, songs and goods from afar. Sermons and stories connected local life to global events. So the parish church was central, but never the limit of their world. Medieval life was mobile, dynamic and connected in ways often overlooked. People's lives extended well beyond a single steeple's shadow. Myth: all medieval battles were huge and bloody. Movies show vast armies clashing endlessly in bloody chaos. But most medieval battles were small compared to modern expectations. A few hundred men often decided local disputes. Even great conflicts rarely saw more than tens of thousands on each side. Many disputes ended in skirmishes or sieges instead of pitched battles. Commanders often avoided open combat since losing one fight could destroy them. Negotiations, truces, and diplomacy played a bigger role than swordplay. Bloodshed was real, but not constant or universal. When large battles did happen, they were dramatic and memorable, but they were rare events, not everyday life. Chroniclers emphasized them because they shaped kingdoms, not because they were common. The myth of non-stop giant battles misses this reality. So medieval warfare was often cautious, calculated, and smaller than legend suggests. It was about power and position, not endless carnage. Myth. Medieval people never read fiction. The myth assumes all reading was religious or practical, but fiction flourished in the Middle Ages. Romances about knights and quests filled manuscripts. Legends of King Arthur and his knights were copied across Europe. Poetry, songs and fables entertained both nobles and townsfolk. Stories of love, adventure and fantasy circulated widely. Travellers carried tales that mixed reality with imagination. Many listeners heard these works read aloud, even if they could not read themselves. Fiction served more than entertainment. It taught lessons, celebrated virtues, and explored human emotions. From bawdy fabliaux to courtly romances, medieval fiction was vibrant and diverse. It revealed how people dreamed and laughed. So the idea of a fictionless Middle Ages is false. Stories were always at the heart of medieval culture. Myth. Medieval people thought the world was static and unchanging. The myth says medieval people saw their world as frozen in time, but their lives were full of change. Seasons shaped planting and harvest. Wars and plague shifted fortunes. Trade introduced new goods, spices, silk, and ideas. New inventions like windmills, spectacles, and improved ploughs transformed daily work. Even faith evolved, with reform movements and new orders rising. Medieval people lived with constant adaptation. Chronicles recorded floods, eclipses, and famines as signs of change. Philosophers debated the nature of time itself. Villages rebuilt after disasters, often stronger than before. Medieval society was never static, it was always in motion. So the myth of timeless stasis is far too simple. People saw, felt, and shaped change in every generation. Myth. Medieval scholars didn't debate or argue ideas. The myth suggests learning was passive with no debate. But medieval universities thrived on argument. Students gathered in halls to dispute questions of law, theology, and philosophy. Professors encouraged public debates known as disputations. Arguments could be fierce, challenging established authorities. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas built entire systems through debate. Others, like William of Ockham, questioned logic and papal authority. Arguments were tools for testing truth, not signs of disrespect. Even outside universities, debate shaped culture. Mystics argued with priests, reformers with bishops, poets with rivals. Disagreement was part of intellectual life, not forbidden. Learning was active, dialogic, and restless. So the myth of silent, obedient scholars misses the reality. Medieval thought was born in the fire of debate. Myth. Every medieval village had a witch. The myth imagined every village plagued by witchcraft. But belief in witches was uneven and often exaggerated. Accusations were rare compared to later centuries. Most villages focused more on crops, taxes, and survival than on hunting witches. Magic was believed in, yes, but it was not always sinister. Healing herbs, charms and blessings were seen as helpful. Cunning folk, local healers, were often respected, not feared. It was only in the late Middle Ages that witch hunts escalated. Even then, not every community shared the panic. Many villages never saw a single witch trial. The myth grows from later exaggerations, not medieval daily life. Fear existed, but it was not universal. So witches were part of folklore, but not a constant presence. Medieval life was too complex to be reduced to endless witch hunting. Myth. Medieval ships couldn't sail far from shore. The myth claims medieval ships were fragile and coast-bound, but shipbuilders designed vessels capable of long journeys. The Viking longship crossed the North Atlantic to Iceland and Greenland. Italian and Spanish galleys carried merchants across the Mediterranean. By the late Middle Ages, larger cogs and caravels sailed the Atlantic. Trade linked northern Europe with Africa and the Near East. Sailors navigated using stars, winds and charts. Exploration expanded steadily before Columbus ever set sail. Medieval ports were hubs of commerce. Genoa, Venice and Bruges thrived on overseas trade. Ships carried pilgrims to the Holy Land and goods to distant markets. So sea travel was not limited to hugging coasts. Medieval ships were bold enough to stitch continents together. The myth of fragile coasting ignores centuries of skilled navigation. Myth. Medieval people thought the stars were just decorations in the sky. The myth imagines people gazing up at stars with no understanding. But medieval astronomy was a respected science. Scholars believed stars were part of celestial spheres, ordered and meaningful. Astrology linked stars to human fate, blending science and belief. Monks tracked stars to guide calendars and prayer times. Sailors used constellations to navigate seas. Poets compared love and fate to the movement of stars. Stars were not decoration. They were essential to life and thought. Astronomical tables from Toledo and Paris guided scholars across Europe. Even errors reflected curiosity and effort, not ignorance. The heavens were studied with rigour, not dismissed as pretty lights. Stars were symbols of order in a changing world. So the myth of empty decoration is wrong. Medieval people lived by the stars in practical and poetic ways. Myth. Medieval people believed giants built old ruins. The myth says people explained ruins only through fantasy. It is true that legends of giants circulated widely. Folk stories connected massive stones with mythical builders, but many also linked ruins to Romans, not giants. Chroniclers in England wrote that Roman legions built ancient roads. Scholars preserved Latin texts describing Roman engineering. The memory of Rome never completely faded. Giants filled the gaps in local lore, but they were not the only explanation. Even peasants sometimes called crumbling ruins old Roman works. Monks recorded ruins as reminders of past empires. Legends blended with knowledge, not replaced it. The myth of total fantasy oversimplifies the picture, so ruins inspired both wonder and memory. Giants were part of the story, but never the whole of it. Myth. Medieval peasants never used tools of iron. The myth imagines peasants farming with only wood and stone. In fact, iron tools were common and essential. Blacksmiths forged ploughshares, hoes and sickles. Iron made farming more efficient, especially in heavy northern soils. By the 11th century, the heavy iron plough revolutionized agriculture. It cut deeper, turned soil faster, and increased yields. Iron nails, knives, and axes filled villages. Without iron, medieval farming could not have sustained Europe's population. Ironworking was a respected trade. Smiths repaired weapons, shoed horses, and supplied households. Tools were passed down through generations, cared for and sharpened. Wood was used too, but iron gave it strength. So peasants were not trapped in the Stone Age. They lived in a world shaped by fire, forge, and iron. Myth. Medieval music never used instruments. The myth imagines medieval music as nothing but monks chanting in cold stone halls, but instruments filled both sacred and secular spaces. Horns and trumpets sounded in courts and on battlefields. Lutes, harps, and fiddles played in taverns and noble chambers. Organs were built for churches as early as the 10th century. Bagpipes, flutes, and drums echoed in village festivals. Even travelling minstrels carried portable instruments to tell their stories. Music was woven into the rhythm of life, not confined to voices alone. Manuscripts preserve not only chants but also notations for instruments. Paintings show musicians performing with viols, psalteries, and bells. Archaeologists have uncovered actual instruments, showing the craftsmanship behind them. The medieval world was alive with sound, from courtly songs to rustic tunes. So the myth of a silent, chant-only age is false. Medieval people created music with a wide range of instruments. Myth. Medieval people never painted in realistic styles. The myth says medieval art was only stiff, flat, and symbolic, but artists worked toward realism long before the Renaissance. Byzantine mosaic showed depth with shimmering glass. Illuminated manuscripts depicted detailed animals, plants, and faces. By the 13th and 14th centuries, painters experimented with perspective and shading. Giotto's frescoes show figures with weight and emotion. English manuscripts include lifelike marginal drawings of birds and beasts. Even religious art sought to make sacred figures feel human. Sculptors carved expressive faces into cathedral portals. Stained glass captured motion in folds of clothing and gestures. These were not primitive doodles, but careful studies of form and space. Realism advanced step by step, not in one sudden leap. So the idea of flat, lifeless art is misleading. Medieval artists pursued beauty and realism centuries before the Renaissance. Myth. Medieval people believed all animals spoke on Christmas Eve. The myth claims everyone believed animals gained speech on holy nights. This tradition appears in folklore, but it was not universal. Stories told of oxen and donkeys kneeling at midnight mass. Some said farm animals whispered blessings to their masters. But the church often discouraged such tales. Preachers warned against taking them literally. Many people saw them as charming stories, not solid belief. Legends varied by region. Not all shared the same customs. Still, the tradition reveals medieval imagination. Animals were central to daily life and often seen as spiritual companions. They carried symbolism in sermons and art, blending faith with folklore. But the myth of everyone believing in talking animals is overstated. So while some cherished the tale, it was never a universal belief. It was folklore more than doctrine. Myth. Medieval law allowed trial only by combat or ordeal. The myth suggests justice meant only duels or walking on hot coals. But legal systems were far more complex. Yes, ordeals and combats existed, especially in the early Middle Ages, but charters, courts, and written law grew steadily across Europe. By the 12th century, trial by jury was emerging in England. Roman law was revived in universities, shaping continental courts. Local lords held courts to settle disputes with witnesses and evidence. Urban centres built records of contracts, debts and property. Combat and ordeal were symbols of divine judgment, but they declined as more rational procedures gained favour. Justice became structured, with growing bureaucracy and law codes. The myth of pure trial by ordeal ignores centuries of legal development. So medieval law was evolving, practical and more orderly than legend suggests. It was not chaos or superstition alone. Myth. Medieval people didn't understand geography at all. The myth assumes medieval people thought the world was shapeless nonsense, but geography was studied seriously in monasteries and universities. Isidore of Seville wrote encyclopedias that mapped the known world. Travellers like Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo brought first-hand reports. Pilgrims knew routes to Rome, Santiago and Jerusalem. Merchants traced paths across the Silk Road. Sailors drew portolan charts with detailed coastlines. Geography may not have been perfect, but it was practical. Maps often mixed fact with faith, placing Jerusalem at the centre. But this reflected values, not ignorance. The sense of a larger world was real, if incomplete. So geography was understood within the limits of knowledge, not denied. Medieval people were curious explorers, not blind wanderers. Their maps reflected belief and experience together. Myth. Medieval towns had no entertainment except church. The myth says townsfolk had nothing to do outside worship. But medieval towns buzzed with entertainment. Fairs filled streets with jugglers, musicians and dancers. Mystery plays dramatized biblical stories with humor and spectacle. Taverns offered games, music and storytelling. Markets were lively social events with gossip and laughter. Carnivals turned towns into places of masks, feasts and chaos. Even guilds sponsored feasts and parades. Churches did organise festivals and holy days, but those often included secular fun, food, song and games. The line between sacred and playful was blurred. So towns had many layers of amusement, not only sermons. Medieval people lived with laughter, play and drama woven into urban life. The myth of joyless towns is false. Myth. Medieval people never questioned ancient authorities. The myth imagined scholars repeating Aristotle or Galen without thought. But medieval thinkers often challenged ancient texts. Doctors tested old remedies against observation. Astronomers corrected Ptolemy's errors with new measurements. Roger Bacon argued for experimentation beyond books. Scholastics debated endlessly, weighing logic against tradition. Even monks copied texts with critical commentary in the margins. Respect for the past did not mean blind obedience. By the late Middle Ages, universities encouraged disputation as a way of learning. Ancient authorities were honoured but not untouchable. Knowledge advanced by questioning, comparing and testing ideas, so the myth of passive repetition is wrong. Medieval minds were lively, curious and critical. They laid groundwork for later revolutions in thought.